There's something about October, isn't there? The air feels colder, sharper, like it's carrying whispers from the other side. The nights stretch longer. The woods grow quieter. And in that silence, things happen. Things people don't like to talk about once the sun comes up. Every October, someone disappears. Every October, someone swears they saw something in the corner of their room. And every October, a few unlucky souls learn that not every ghost is a story. Some of them are real. I've spent weeks collecting the stories you're about to hear. They aren't myths. They aren't campfire tales. These are real events. Things that happen to real people. Recorded in police reports, newspapers, and in the trembling voices of survivors. And maybe, just maybe, by the time we're done, you'll start to wonder what's waiting in the shadows outside your window tonight. So, before we begin, turn off the lights, grab your headphones, make sure your doors are locked tight, and remember, once you hear these stories, you can't unhear them. If you love true horror, real encounters, and the stories that linger long after the video ends, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Like this video to help it reach more brave souls, and comment below which story haunted you the most. Now, take a deep breath. It's time to step into the darkness. These are 5 disturbing, true October horror stories. I still wake sometimes with the sound of glass breaking in my ears, not from a movie, not from a nightmare I had as a child, but from standing in a small Midwestern kitchen and listening to a woman tell me how she fought for her life while someone took her son from the next room. It was October when it happened, October 13th, 1997, and for a long time afterward the date felt like an ache in the town's teeth. One of those things people politely avoid saying aloud because saying it seems to summon the memory. 10-year-old Joel was asleep in the house on that quiet Lawrenceville night when something violent slid into the place between mattress and light switch. His mother, Julie, says she ran to him after hearing him scream and that an intruder attacked her, then fled into the darkness. That is the version she has always told. When I first met Julie, months after the trial and years after the killing, she was carrying herself like someone who had learned to hold herself steady under a wind. You meet people like that sometimes. They are not brittle so much as compressed, like a sponge squeezed and put down to dry. Her voice was even when she told me again the thing she told police the night it happened. The roughness of a ski mask's edge beneath her palms, the knife taken from the butcher block, the way she ran crashed through glass on her way out, and the detail that colored everything afterward. She had given a careful description of the intruder. She held to that memory with a conviction that made the rest of us feel uneasy. If you have ever tried to reconcile what you witnessed with what a court decides, you know how the story can splinter into competing versions. The legal story is, in its own way, a different kind of terror. Within a few years, the investigation had made a disturbing turn. Rather than follow a trail from the scene outward, law enforcement looked inward and found a suspect a little too close for comfort. Julie was charged, tried, and convicted in a trial that left many people asking afterward why the focus had shifted the way it did and whether certain pieces of evidence had been given too much weight while others were ignored. The jury returned a guilty verdict and a sentence that read like an impossible future: 65 years. For a mother who had never stopped saying, "He wasn't there. Someone came into the house." The conviction felt like the town locking its doors not to outsiders, but to the truth. I remember the courtrooms because they smell like wood and fluorescent lights and the slow machinery of authority. They are places designed to make complicated things feel orderly, but no apparatus of law can reconstruct a bedroom the way an eyewitness can. And yet eyewitnesses are messy things, memories bent by sleep, fear, and the small betrayals of time. In Julie's case, there were pieces of testimony that, years later, would look to many observers like the scaffolding of a wrongful conviction. emotionally charged testimony about private matters that had little to do with the facts at hand, and interpretations of blood pattern evidence that some experts would later question. The first trial didn't feel like a simple march toward justice. It felt, to many who followed it, like an editing room where the version of events selected was the one that fit a prosecutorial narrative. Then, as if the story had more than one final draft, another voice entered. Tommy Lynn Sells. A name that would one day be whispered in corridors where people still argued about who did what. Sells was a serial killer, a drifter whose confessions over the years painted him as a man who moved across states leaving violence in his wake. In 2004, 7 years after Joel's murder, Sells gave an account of breaking into a Lawrenceville home on October 13, 1997, taking a knife from a kitchen block, killing a sleeping child, and scuffling with a woman who confronted him. The similarities to Julie's own account were chilling on the page. A stranger, a butcher block knife, the intruder fleeing into the night. When I first read the transcript of Sells' admission, I felt something shift in my chest. Not relief, not yet, but the small, tremulous possibility that a different kind of truth might still be possible. You have to understand what a confession like that does to a small town. Imagine the whole community holding its breath for years, trying to make sense of a death that should have been an isolated horror. Then picture an outsider, a man whose life had been described in headlines as a trail of brutality, claiming responsibility for that very wound. Some neighbors welcomed the confession like news that could finally let them exhale. Others resisted, wary that the narrative switch might just be another turn in a long, cruel story. The prosecution, in turn, was skeptical. Confessions by notorious killers are complicated things. They can be fabrications, attempts at attention, or, in some cases, a guilty man's way of acknowledging more crimes than the state can prove. The state maintained that Sells might be lying. For the family and for Julie, though, the confession was a lifeline they could not ignore. Legal systems are not built to move solely on emotion or late-day-breaking confessions. They have rules and precedents, and sometimes those rules can produce the strangest of rescues. In Julie's case, it was not Sells' statement alone that changed the course of her path through the courts. An appellate ruling flagged procedural errors in her initial prosecution, notably the problematic appointment of special prosecutors, and ordered a new trial in 2024. That legal turn opened a door for a more thorough review of the physical evidence, of the testimony, and of Sells' confession itself. The new trial would give Julie a chance to present forensic analysis and to argue that the injuries she suffered were not self-inflicted, but the result of a violent struggle with an intruder, exactly what she had always said. I remember sitting in the courtroom during the retrial and watching how the rhythm of the trial changed. The defense brought in experts who challenged previous interpretations of bloodstain patterns, pointing out that the physical facts could support the idea of an assailer fleeing through the house. They played recordings of Sells' statements and laid out a timeline that, while not flawless, was consistent with someone who had been in the area. The prosecution pushed back, arguing that Sells had reason to lie, that confessions from carnivores of attention are not rare. But in that long human weave of testimony, evidence, and cross-examination, the jury found reasonable doubt. On July 26, 2006, Julie was found not guilty. The release was not the same as restitution. It did not build back the years she had lost or conjure the life that had been cut short. But it unlatched a door that had been sealed. What stays with me long after the verdict is not just the legal ledger, but the private, tiny things. Julie standing outside the courthouse and breathing sunlight as if it were a new thing she needed to learn to keep in her lungs. Neighbors bringing flowers. The way the local coffee shop felt quieter when she walked in, like a place holding its breath in recognition of the woman who had been through a nightmare. And come out, Mark. There is a slow work of repair after a wrongful conviction. It is not found in press releases so much as in the awkward dinners, the apologies that are too late, and the long, patient chores of rebuilding a life. The courts can change a verdict, but they cannot stitch back the early morning hours Joel is no longer alive to own. I have asked myself more than once what this case teaches about the way communities respond to violence and grief. Part of the answer is this: the need to find an actor, someone to blame, can sometimes be stronger than the commitment to finding the right one. It's simpler to close ranks and make the loss into a moral calculus that fits the people you already know. In small towns, where everybody has a footprint on every porch, suspicion is corrosive because it eats not only at alleged perpetrators, but at ties that hold families and neighborhoods together. Julie's case showed how easily prosecutorial momentum can coalesce around a narrative, how the parlors of rumor can become witnesses in court, and how malevolent interpretations of private behavior can be used as evidence when they do not belong there. And yet, the story also contains stubborn, human tenderness. I think about the friends who never stopped checking on Julie in prison, the lawyers who took her case on pro bono, the small organizations that study wrongful convictions and make the case that systems fail in repeatable ways. Justice, imperfect though it is, sometimes bends back under pressure. The system's routines, appeals, reviews, expert testimony are where the possibility of correction lies. Those mechanisms are not heroic, they're bureaucratic and slow, and they sometimes fail. But in this instance, they opened a space where the truth could breathe again. When I leave Lawrenceville now, the town looks like many other towns. Churches, a main street, a diner with a neon sign that washes the sidewalk in fuzzy light. Children still play in yards. People go to grocery stores and baseball games. The date October 13th still hangs like a shadow for those who remember. But life, in its usual inevitability, moves on. That is not a consolation for a mother who lost a son, but it is part of the larger story. Tragedy and recovery woven together in a way that resists tidy endings. If there's one image from the whole thing that I carry, it is simple and stubborn. Julie sitting on her porch after she got out, holding a cup of coffee with both hands as if the warmth were something she needed to convince herself exists. She told me once that she could still feel Joel's small body in the house, in a way that would never leave, an ache that had been hollowed into memory. She had been cleared by the courts, and the state would later issue a certificate of innocence. But no legal certificate can make up for a child's life. What it can do, and what it did for Julie, was restore her name and give her back a place in a town that had once judged her without the whole story. That, in a way, mattered a great deal. In the years since, the case has become a cautionary tale told in law schools and Innocence Project lectures. How fragile the border is between grief and accusation. How careful we must be before converting suspicion into certainty. For anyone who tells stories, who tries to put human events into a shape that can be understood, Julie's story is a reminder. The way we seek answers matters. When we fail to look outward first, when we turn inward and fix upon those closest to a tragedy because it is easiest, we risk making another kind of violence. The work after that kind of mistake is slow and humble, and if we are lucky, redemptive in the sort of small human ways that mean more than headlines. I do not tell this as an elegy for the justice system. It is not that simple, but as an account of how a town learns to live again, and how a mother learns to hold a grief that will never leave her while claiming a name the law no longer stains. In the end, the story is both the worst of what can happen when fear chooses a face, and the best of what can happen when other people refuse to let that face be the last word. I remember the first time I walked that crooked stretch of road in Salem, the wind pushing the late October leaves like dry paper across my boots. The town looks like a postcard until you notice how the trees seem to huddle, how the houses tilt in on one another as if to keep a secret. People came to see the witch trials as folklore and as horror theater, costumes and bookstores and tours, but there is a particular hush to the autumn air there if you let yourself look for it. It's the weight of a place that has learned to live with a stain. I had studied the dates and names in books, like anyone who thinks history is a tidy list of facts, months and ledgers and trial transcripts. But standing on the cobblestone and walking between the old meeting house and the place where the gallows once stood, it shifts. The numbers become bodies, where the wind can find purchase on a sleeve or on a past hat. The panic of 1692 is easier to confess as a long list when it's ink on a page. It becomes something nearer and sharper when you can taste the salt of the harbor and imagine the creak of a rope. The crisis started in the winter and flattened into the spring and summer. Odd fits from girls in the village, pointed fingers, neighbors testifying against neighbors. Accusations multiply until the jails brimmed with people nobody would have suspected. Elderly women who kept the town's recipes in their heads, prosperous men with documents and land, servants who could do no more than fold their hands and pray. In those months, the court system itself bent under the pressure of fear, and the courts that convened were eager for proof of the devil's work in plain, theatrical ways. Those eager courts accepted testimony that now strains our credulity, visions, fits, spectral evidence. The claim that a victim could feel the chill of a hand that existed only in a dream. The kind of logic that had the power to condemn a neighbor as a witch thrived in the absence of anything like a modern standard for proof. By late summer, the executions had already reshaped the town's calendar. June brought the first hangings. By September, lines of people had been led to the place we now call Proctor's Ledge, a rough, rocky outcrop near Gallows Hill, and been put to death. I read the lists and tried to imagine a single day in late September when 8 people were hanged at once. Neighbors forced into a public spectacle while the rest of the community watched, sometimes in horror, sometimes in a grim mix of curiosity and relief that the crisis seemed, for a moment, to have found an outlet. That kind of mass execution is a blunt, brutal punctuation in any era, but in a small colony, it ripped open the fabric of how neighbors recognized one another. October came with a different tone. There are 1,000 little shifts that betray a turning point, a minister's sermon that no longer comforts, a magistrate who suddenly reads the law aloud with the weight of reconsideration in his voice, a governor who returns to the province and looks at the chaos and decides that the machinery of justice is misfiring. Around the end of October 1692, Governor William Phips did something decisive. He dissolved the special court of Oyer and Terminer that had been handling the witch trials. That was the moment when official authority stepped in and said, in effect, enough. Standing in the small Salem Museum, I could feel how the later apologies and legislative reparations are important but imperfect responses. The colony would, in later years, admit error and compensate families. Ministers would repent, and one judge would write his own regret into a record. But none of those bureaucratic apologies ever became a voice you could tuck into a child's ear to explain why a grandmother had been put to death. Legal acts do not return a life. They do not warm a body that has gone cold on a late summer afternoon centuries ago. What they do is create a paper trail that future readers can follow, and if they care, learn from. The court's reliance on spectral evidence, the notion that a person's spirit could hurt another while the accused was physically elsewhere, is the linchpin of how this could happen. When a legal system permits testimony that cannot be tested or disconfirmed, it invites tragedy. You could see that in the faces of those who later had to live with the knowledge that they had participated in verdicts that would hang people. I spoke with historians who told me the exact count. Some lists say 19 were hanged, 1 man was pressed to death, and several others died in jail. And hearing the numbers in lecture halls is one thing. Looking at the names etched on memorial stones, feeling how small the letters are, and how determined someone was to make a mark, is another. The ledger becomes a ledger of humans. There's an image that keeps coming back to me. The town meeting house in a late October dusk, the light inside a small pale rectangle against the dark. Men whose hands shook had to read charges aloud. Parents listened, perhaps recognizing some neighbor's voice on the stand, and then having to swallow the cognitive dissonance of that recognition. The social ties of a colony, intermarriages, shared labor, the shared work of harvest, had been rewired by fear into a network of suspicion. Accusations broke long-standing relationships in ways that records can only hint at. You could find entire families turned either into accusers or accused, and sometimes both. I spent an afternoon at the site where the courthouse once stood and thought about how physical places keep memory like a kind of stored weather. The courthouse was not special looking. It was wooden and practical. But that practicality is frightening when you realize it was the stage where ordinary people authorized extraordinary punishments. The administrative decisions that allowed spectral evidence in court came not from fog or superstition alone, but from human choices, judges and magistrates who wanted to root out evil as they saw it. When I read the transcripts, the tone is formal and dedicated. When I heard stories about the same proceedings, both in expert interviews and in the diaries that have survived, there was confusion, and then, once the die was cast, a grim determination to follow through. One of the lesser discussed injustices was what happened to those left behind. Property seized, reputations shredded, families impoverished. When you accuse a neighbor of witchcraft in a 17th century Puritan community, you are effectively asking the town to brand that person as both a social and spiritual pariah. That stigma is long-lived. The legal remedies that came decades later could never fully mend the loss. In a few instances, the colony paid restitution, but money is a paltry substitute for the work those people would have done and the lives their descendants might have had. I also found, in the margins of those records, stories of courage and conscience. There were ministers and lay people who spoke out against the acceptance of spectral evidence. Increase Mather, a towering clerical figure of the time, warned the magistrates that spectral evidence was dangerously unreliable. His words were, in their own way, an intervention. The church, which had been both a source of comfort and a contributor to panic, had voices of restraint that eventually helped shape the decision to clamp down on the courts. When the governor dissolved the tribunal in October, he had the benefit, I suspect, of a shifting public sensibility. The townspeople had seen enough to know that the one thing you cannot let a court do is trade in testimony that cannot be confronted or cross-examined. Walking through the old graveyards, you keep meeting names that were once spoken under breath and then stamped into memory. People like Rebecca Nurse, John Proctor, and others who had lived ordinary, complicated lives and were then forced to the scaffold. Looking at their markers, and at the monument on Proctor's Ledge that today stands where once a rope cut into October air, I felt a strange kinship with the idea that memory is both monument and admonition. The memorial exists not only to remember but to warn. This is what unchecked fear can do. After the court was dissolved, the machinery of law did what law does. It picked up the pieces and tried to set them in order so that future judges would not repeat the same mistakes. The superior court that followed was instructed to disallow spectral evidence. Its approach was more cautious and led to acquittals and releases. Over the next years, the colony would grapple with compensation, with apologies, and with a social reckoning that would take generations to settle into something like closure. The apologies are a public ritual of repair, but the real repair is quieter. It is the town learning, slowly, to speak to one another again, to trust again, to find a way to live alongside a history that is painful to hold. There is a paradox at the heart of this story that I keep turning over. People who feared the devil were capable of a particular cruelty in his name. They were not monsters by the measures of everyday cruelty. They were often market-goers, fathers, women who sewed, men who worked in the shipyards. Yet in a context saturated by anxiety, the threat of war, the stresses of frontier life, the religious conviction that the devil is real and anywhere, ordinary people made choices that led to extraordinary violence. The lesson I take from standing on those streets is not that people are evil by nature, but that fear, unchecked and given legal license, is a dangerous animal. It eats the fruit of community and leaves the trunk to rot. I left Salem on a damp October evening with the sky threaded by long, migrating shapes of geese and the memory of the town's hush in my ears. As a storyteller and a witness, the thing that keeps me awake is not the spectacle of the hangings or the name of a judge. It is the small human detail. A neighbor overheard a slanderous whisper, and then signed a deposition. A child's hysterics were treated as evidence. A man who refused to confess was pressed with stones until he died rather than give the court a verdict to act on. Those details are what history remembers when it is doing its worst, the surfaces of what went wrong. If you stand in October on the ledge overlooking where the hangings took place, the wind will touch you like a finger. It will not tell you anything mystical. It will only remind you that we are all answerable, if not to a higher power, then at least to each other. The Salem trials and their cessation in that autumn of 1692 are a civic caution that is still relevant. When the machinery of justice begins to accept things that cannot be proven, when panic becomes the currency of credibility, the moral cost is immense. I tell this story not to conjure ghosts or to sensationalize pain, but because October in Salem is a small, stark lesson about what happens when fear crowds out reason. We remember the names carved into stone, not as tokens of sensational history, but as humans who paid the highest price for the failure of institutions to hold fast to a standard of evidence and to patience. In that hush, when the leaves are falling and the town is holding its breath, you can still hear, if you listen closely, the echo of those who were silenced. And if history has taught us anything, it is that the echo is a kind of teacher. It asks us to be more careful with suspicion, more generous with doubt, and firmer in how we protect the innocent from the ravenous appetite of panic. I first heard about the Glatzel house because someone at the paper slid a folded note across my desk and said, half joking and half terrified, "You should cover this. It sounds like something out of a dime store novel." The headline nobody wanted to write for the paper had a way of calling to the same crooked curiosity in everyone. A family in a small New England town. Strange behaviors that suggested something beyond ordinary explanation, and the names of people who I went to Brookfield in October because that's what reporters do. We go where people are afraid, because fear makes facts come sharp. The house sat in the kind of quiet cul-de-sac where the only sound is the wind in birch branches and the occasional dog's bark, the kind of street where you could hear a car door close from 2 houses down. It was autumn, and the leaves had already begun to scatter like tired confetti. The air had the brittle edge that made you expect something small and odd to happen any minute. When I walked up the driveway, the family who greeted me looked, at first glance, like any other. Tired, smaller in the eyes than in the photographs they had given the paper. Protective in the way parents always are when there's a risk to their child. The mother, I'll call her by her name because it's the truth of the thing, even if the courtroom would later make us feel like all names were evidence, said the trouble started months ago but worsened late that summer. Her son, an 11-year-old named David, first complained of headaches and nightmares. He woke screaming about shadows that did not belong to anything in the room. Then there were the scratches, long, angry lines on his arms that appeared overnight, as if made by nails he did not possess. He spoke in voices that were not his own, voices that promised harm in the sing-song cadence of children, and then rolled into something older and merciless. Things moved when no one was in the room. Objects were found in places they could not have been placed by human hands. The family's sleep thinned into a set of anxious watches. When I asked them what they thought was happening, they looked at me like someone looking at a mirror and not liking the face that peered back. "We don't know," the father told me. "We just know something is wrong." That confession, uttered in a voice that folded in the edges of hope and terror, is one I've heard many times since, from people whose private lives tumble into the uncanny. It feels like bargaining. Not knowing is better, at least, than knowing you are being touched by a thing you do not understand. Neighbors told their own stories in the same hushed, half-embarrassed tone. Strange noises, people swore. The family's dog howled at empty corners and refused to enter certain rooms. In small towns, you get odd tales all the time. A busted window here, a rumor there. You learn to measure them. But this was different. The presence, whatever you want to call it, had a kind of insistence that grew like mold. When it crept into the narrative of your life, it changed what you would accept as normal. Word traveled, as it always does, until it reached the Warrens. Ed and Lorraine arrived as part of their work. If you've ever seen photographs of them, you know how they were often photographed. Ed with his square, authoritative angles. Lorraine with hands that seemed always ready to touch or to bless. They offered to help in a way that was both professional and religious. Prayer, rituals, and what they described as an attempt to identify the source of the malevolent behavior. To some in town, they were angels. To others, they were charlatans who wore belief like a costume. Talk of them made the town's established anxieties fold in on themselves like paper. The Warrens' account, the one people would hear on radio and then see on late-night talk shows, said that when they visited the home, they felt a malignancy in the rooms, a presence that resisted ordinary explanation. They recounted an episode in which the boy was allegedly levitated during a ritual, or in which objects threw themselves from shelves. They said the demonic force had, at moments, used the child as a conduit, speaking through him and promising harm. That kind of claim changes the geometry of a house. Suddenly, ordinary rooms become arenas. You stop seeing the home as a shelter and start checking corners like a person learning to avoid tripwires. I am a reporter. What I want is evidence, the kind of proof that can be boxed and labeled. Evidence is not prayer or exorcism, but evidence is also not the whole story. I listened to eyewitness testimony. I watched a child whose eyes would shift into things that made even the most skeptical listener swallow hard. Faces went slack at the memory. People shied away from the way the family described the boy's wakefulness at night. I heard the chant of a voice that was not a child's voice, and a small room vibrate like a bell. Whether one believes in demons or in psychological pathology, there was a hum of reality to the family's pain that could not be discounted. The town's priests were divided. Some said the Warrens were a necessary external check, an outside perspective for a family who felt on the brink. Others were standoffish, wary of what they considered sensationalism. Catholics in the diocese spoke of rituals and diocesan procedures. They urged caution, saying that the church had its own formal channels for these things. You could feel the invisible tug of war between different authorities: the clergy, the police, the Warrens, and the mental health professionals. For that family, caught in the crossfire of competing certainties, the choice of whom to turn to was not a theoretical question. It was survival. Belief in their calculus became practical. You cannot sit in a living room while a family tells you about voices calling names and pretend you are unmoved. Human beings, including journalists, carry empathy like a second metabolism. The boy's mother showed me a VHS she had taped of David. I watched it because in the end, it was my job to see. In the footage, his posture would change. His head would twist in a way that was not the child's. He uttered, in a voice that scraped like wind through old boards, phrases that made me feel smaller and more foolish for assuming I understood the limits of the world. Later, skeptics would say the tape was edited or coached. Other skeptics would say it proved nothing, and both had their points. But the tape had effect. It made the ordinary townspeople who watched it feel like the floor had dropped out from under the house. Then, in a way that made the story go from strange to tragic, the demonic narrative took a human body and walked into the court system. Months after the Warrens' involvement, a young man named Aaron Cheyenne Johnson, the boyfriend of David's older sister, found himself in a confrontation that ended with the fatal stabbing of another man, Alan Bono. The incident did not happen in the Glotzel household in October. It happened afterward in February. But the sequence of events that began in that autumn carried a freight of implication that could not be ignored. The defense would later try to use demonic possession as a legal argument. He was not himself, they said, pointing toward a case that blurred the line between metaphysical claim and criminal responsibility. I remember sitting in the courthouse and watching lawyers move like chess players around a piece nobody knew how to name. The defense tried to bring the alleged possession into the courtroom as an explanation for violence. The judge, practical and immovable in a way only judges can be, refused to allow an explicit withdrawal into demonology. It's not hard to see why. The law wants explanations it can weigh and test. The supernatural is, by its nature, resistant to the kinds of replication and observation that courts need. Possession did not fit into the evidentiary boxes. The jury was given something less metaphysical to consider: mens rea, intent. Did the accused have the mind to commit murder? That question, framed in dry legalese, was the most human and least comforting part of the whole affair. When I stepped out of the courthouse after those first hearings, the October air had hardened into February cold. People outside debated whether belief had blinded the town or revealed something true all along. Some said the murdered man's death had nothing to do with spirits. It was a human act that could be explained by alcohol-fueled anger or poor impulse control. Others, especially those who had witnessed the boy's strange episodes, felt that something transcendental seeped into the case like ink into cloth. There are, in any story like this, small truths that complicate every myth. Arne's life before the killing was noisy with ordinary choices. He was a young man with obligations and a temper. He was also close to David and had been present in the household during some of the strange episodes. Whether that proximity made him culpable in a metaphysical sense or simply exposed him to the family's crisis is where the lines blur. People want to reduce such things to a single motive or a single cause, but human events are braided ropes. Multiple strands interact until the whole snaps. I interviewed psychiatrists who suggested that mass hysteria and suggestion could explain much of what appeared supernatural. They talked about dissociative states, psychological splinters that make a person act in ways disconnected from their normal self. And they pointed to stress and trauma as the kinds of engines that could power dramatic, inexplicable behavior. Their explanations are clinical and satisfying in the way that a map satisfies a lost traveler. But they do not always quiet the sense of awe or the sting of the uncanny. What puzzled me more than the question of metaphysics was the way ordinary lives were consumed by extraordinary narrative. Families were interviewed by television crews. Neighbors became spokespeople for the town's horror. The case became a public mirror reflecting back how hungry we are for explanations that make the world meaningful, even if those explanations are dangerous. The town of Brookfield learned the cost of being both small and visible. It found that privacy can be a fragile shield against the hunger of public curiosity. Years later, when I drove past the Glatzel house, the paint was slightly peeled and someone had planted marigolds near the mailbox. The house looked like most houses do, patched, lived in, a repository of small domestic failures and private victories. You could stand in front of it and feel resentful at how ordinary things get dressed up into spectacles. You could also stand there and feel tender for a family who had been wrenched through an ordeal that left no clean edges. There is a passage in the memory that I return to. The mother, years after the events, telling me quietly that whether the thing in the house was a devil, a disorder, or the product of someone's imagination, the harm was real. She spoke of nights spent awake, begging for the boy's safety, of the way neighbors came by to hold a casserole dish in awkward, helpful hands. She spoke about trying to reclaim a life where bedtime was a ritual, not an ordeal. That human striving, not the spectacle of exorcism, not the courtroom drama, was the most honest part of the story. In retelling this, I do not pretend to adjudicate the metaphysical truth of possession. I am not a priest and not a psychiatrist. I am a witness to the way ordinary people cope when their reality tilts. The Brookfield case is a knot of faith, fear, public appetite, and private breakdown. It shows how the unknown can be given a name, demon, disease, or otherwise, and how that naming shapes the path of grief, blame, and, sometimes, redemption. When I close my eyes and try to keep all the strands together, what stays with me is the smallness of the family's kitchen table. The way a child's bowl sat untouched while adults argued about things larger than themselves, and the way a town watches when one of its houses becomes a stage. There is tragedy in the death that follows, in the life that is lost to incarceration, and in the suffering that neither faith nor science can dissolve entirely. The Brookfield story is not a neatly wrapped moral. It is a wound that has scabbed and left a scar that everyone who lived through it in ways both public and private, carries. If there is a lesson that belongs to the retelling, it is this: when a family is in pain, the truth is rarely a single, luminous thing. It is many small truths stitched together by perception, desperation, and the personal vocabulary people bring to fear. We tell ourselves stories to make the world less arbitrary, but we must be careful, because the story we choose can bind us just as certainly as anything else. I was living in the suburbs at October, the kind of place where the maples finally gave up their leaves, and you could feel the year tightening like a band around the town. People were getting sweaters out of trunks, dusting off football jackets, and making lunches with thermoses for work that tasted like a season. We moved through our small routines with the ease of people who had never been called into fear, until fear began to answer our every question. The first time we heard about a sniper in the city, I remember thinking it was an impossible, movie-silly thing. Snipers belong to war footage and thrillers, not to the grocery store parking lot where I left my card and texted my wife. But the calls, the alerts, the hushed conversations at the gas station took a while to become a pattern. Then the pattern hardened into dates. The shootings began in early October and stretched over 3 weeks, each new bulletin, another little cut across the town's skin. Between October 2 and October 24th, 2002, the attacks unfolded across our region, and they didn't feel random. They felt like a slow, strategic tightening, the way a hand might close around a throat. At first, it seemed like bad luck. Someone here, someone there. But luck does not work that way. 10 people were killed and several more wounded in that short month. Ordinary people doing ordinary things. Pumping gas, walking into a store, sitting in a parking lot. We stopped doing ordinary things the same way. We stopped lingering. We started making our evening's appointments with urgency. The idea of walking alone to a convenience store felt suddenly indecent, as if you were defying some quiet, watchful rule. Knowing the numbers, the dead, the wounded, made it official. The world had narrowed into smaller, measurable danger. I remember the specific cold that seemed to arrive earlier that October. Nights came earlier, and so did the dread. For weeks, the city felt like a patient holding its breath. My brother stopped filling the tanks on his truck at night. He started timing errands for midday when gas stations were more crowded. Schools locked down. A friend of mine who worked at a hardware store told me there were men who came in asking for bolt cutters and metal saws, as if planning something, or as if trying to prepare for the suspicion that had begun to sit in every chest. The fear had an architecture. It was contained in the ways we changed the small things. We taped our car doors at night. We left lights on under porches. We spoke in smaller voices on the phones, not because of what we were saying, but because we were too afraid to let anyone overhear anything ordinary. The media did what the media does. It fed and then reflected the panic. And then it fed the panic some more. The television anchors and the talk shows took those small private anxieties and made them into an age-day theater. With every replayed grainy image of a sedan, every fiber of a police sketch, the snipers became less invisible and more omnipresent. A voice on the radio and a photograph on the screen. For a time, the most mundane errands, getting a newspaper, buying milk, felt like walking into a set designed to trap you. You began to notice the pattern the shooters used. They picked quiet, exposed places where the ordinary person could be at ease. That was the cruelty. Terrorists in stories often pick grand stages. These men quietly made the routine into the stage. I used to go to a small cafe off the Beltway, the kind of place where the barista knows your order. One morning in October, I walked in, and the place smelled like coffee and cinnamon rolls. That day, the entire dining room was a congregation of anxious faces. Someone would speak, the room would twist its ears, and then the conversation would fold back into silence. People spoke of the day's latest shooting in the same voice you used to speak about a neighbor's sudden illness, half rumor, half prayer. It felt as if the city's social life had split into before and after a single phone call that would come someday. a phantom ring that would make everything tilt. We were living inside an ambiguity that makes the mind hungry for names and faces. Then the name arrived: John Allen Muhammad and Lee Boyd Malvo. They were not mysterious foreign operatives. They were two men traveling in a car, a blue 1990 Chevrolet Caprice, that became, in a grotesque inversion of the safe family sedan, a mobile weapon. The image of that vehicle, its plainness turned sinister, lodged in our brains. The idea that someone could sit inches from you in a vehicle that looked like every other car on the road and aim and pull a trigger was the vivid new fear we had to carry. There are small moments that feel ridiculous until you realize they were practice for something else. I remember ordering pizza one night and watching the delivery driver get into his car with an exaggerated caution, like someone who'd been taught to look twice before they started the engine. We all learned to watch the parking lot like it might tell us a secret. We learned to keep our heads down at gas pumps, to close windows at red lights, to not stand by our cars with our wallets where anyone could see them. Fear rewired normal memory. It taught us to expect the extraordinary in the places where we felt safest. I used to travel that stretch of Interstate 70 toward the city enough to know where the rest stops were. Rest stops were the kinds of anonymous places where truckers and late-night drivers intersect. On October 24th, 2002, a call from a driver at a rest stop changed everything. Someone noticed the blue Caprice, the same one broadcast on every news channel that day, and called police. Within hours, the police swarmed the rest area and found them sleeping inside the car. The sense of relief across the region when they made the arrest was instantaneous. It was as if people could suddenly breathe again. The idea that men who had made the city into a theater of fear might be in custody was a relief that tasted almost like forgiveness for the months of panic. But capture is not the same thing as understanding. Even after the men were arrested, questions multiplied like ganglia. Why here? Why like that? Why those victims? The answer people wanted, a tidy explanation of motive, was messy and didn't fit what we saw. Some people said extortion. Some said a young man led astray. Some said the darker thing, that a bond of manipulation and resentment had built toward a monstrous act. The trial that followed peeled the case into more documents and testimonies, trying to reduce the human meat of it into boxes that could be checked. Facts emerged: a rifle, a trunk hole cut into the sedan, ballistics connecting that weapon to many of the shootings, all the technical markers of a planned spree. Those technicalities traced the contour of a rationale that made it neither purely accidental nor neatly ideological, simply deliberate and cold. I remember the sound of sirens the day after the arrest, not the chaotic chorus of before, but the controlled official clip of law enforcement asserting that they had done what they were meant to do. People stood at corners telling the story in bursts, their voices flat with exhaustion. There's a peculiar thing about our relief. It felt as fragile as the rest of our lives had felt those weeks. Even with the guns seized and the names attached to them, the nervousness did not unmoor instantly. You could see that in how the city continued to lock down schools at the slightest hint of threat for months afterward. The habit of fear is harder to displace than any single event. I lost a friend to that terror. He wasn't one of the killed. He was the kind of person who felt the recoil of the attacks in the small private fissures that followed. He owned a small delivery business and for weeks refused to send his drivers out at dusk. He stopped sleeping through the night. One October afternoon, he called me and said, half laughing and half panicked, "I feel like I'm watching myself move through life." He was describing the same dissociation I'd seen in other people. A sense that your body and your decisions had been separated by a thin film of fear. You go through motions in a mechanical, efficient way, not because you don't care, but because you have been forced into a kind of deferential, cautious living. There are quieter things that don't make the national timeline but shape people forever. My neighbor began carrying a small can of pepper spray and a flashlight. She kept a list of the days that had been quiet and the days that had not. At community meetings, people argued about how to find safety. More police patrols, more cameras, fewer open lawns. The muscle memory of fear restructured neighborhood life. People introduced themselves differently. You learned details about next-door neighbors not because you wanted them, but because you needed to check for signs, to make sure the people around you could be trusted. The snipers rewired our social architecture in tiny, interfering ways. When I think back on that month, there's a peculiar sense of how ordinary gestures were weaponized. A hole drilled in a trunk became a periscope for killing. A parked sedan became a hunting blind. That image, the trunk turned into a firing nest, is one of those small facts that lodges in your mind as proof that ordinary objects can be repurposed into instruments of terror. When people told that part of the story in the weeks after, there was a collective shiver. To be ordinary was not protection, it could be camouflage. In the hush that followed the arrests, you could hear the slow unspooling of individual stories. Families sorting grief, communities trying to stitch the seams of normalcy back together. But you also heard courtrooms and verdicts, each a public attempt to make meaning out of what had happened. The legal outcomes were not a tidy closure. Muhammad would be sentenced to death. Malvo, a minor at the time, would receive life terms. We watched the justice system move in its measured bureaucratic ways. The punishments brought neither resurrection nor absolute peace, but they were the rituals we had left to channel our anger and grief. There are things that you cannot legislate away. The emotional residue of those weeks lingered in ways that statistics could not measure. I knew a woman who refused to go to the cemetery alone for months, even to visit her father's grave. Another man, whose daughter had been at a nearby mall during one of the shootings, began driving her to school every morning and sitting in the car until she was safely inside. These are the splinters left behind, accommodations to fear that become the new natural. In neighborhoods, this shows up as new curfews for kids, as reluctance to let teenagers drive at night, as fewer late-night social visits. Sometimes the memories sharpen into something corrosive. I have been at family gatherings where the conversation, normally light and circular, slid into a recollection of the snipers and the attitudes that came with them. People speak about the way they watched others' behaviors with the close attention of someone measuring a stranger's heartbeat. You begin to mistrust not just the potential for violence, but the mundane interiority of other people, their moods, their absences, the way they look at their phones. Which is to say, terror warps your sense of otherness. It makes your neighbor's silence a possible prelude to danger. The trials were long and publicly messy in the kind of way that exposes both the legal system and the social hunger for narrative. During the court proceedings, there was an attempt, always imperfect, to pin a motive to the violence, to make it a shape we could understand. The idea that one man could wield influence over a younger man, that the relationship between Muhammad and Malvo held a toxic, paternal dynamic, came to dominate much of the narrative. We heard about grooming and manipulation, and the way power can be wielded quietly, privately. These ideas were a bitter kind of relief because they allowed us to see the crime as the outcome of human cruelty rather than abstract randomness. Yet, the understanding didn't feel like absolution. It felt like content that unsettled us further. You realize then that comprehension is not the same as healing. Once, several winters after the arrests, I was walking in a park just as the daylight was flattening into dusk. A student with a camera was photographing children playing on swings in that weird, eager way younger people do, trying to catch a slice of life. Watching those children, in their careless laughter, their distracted bravery, I felt something like a small, reverent hope. Terror had not managed to steal all that. The instinct to play, to live out loud, was still there. But there was also a new carefulness in the way parents lingered at the edges of playgrounds, in the way drivers paused to check surroundings, in the manner we taught children to be small witnesses to the world rather than unguarded participants. There is a final thing to tell you about that month. It is this: terror is a teacher that does not give gentle lessons. It shows you how fragile ordinary life can be, and then leaves you to figure out what to do with that knowledge. In the months and years after October 2002, the Washington area learned to be more attentive in the minor rhythms of life. Communities set up channels of communication. Neighbors fortified routines with mutual care. People started to speak out of a clearer awareness that safety is not a passive thing. It's a shared practice. Even now, when I pass a gas station late at night, I have a small automatic checklist I run through in my head. Exit aisle blocked by a truck, car doors locked, a good line of sight between you and the street. None of those checks would have stopped every act of cruelty, and none of them would bring back a life. But they are the ways we learn to live with a world that can tilt toward horror in an instant. The Beltway snipers taught us that by taking the sliver of the ordinary and making it the scene of violence, they could teach an entire region to be braced and watchful. They failed, though, in one private way. The children kept playing, the coffee shop still opened in the mornings, and in small, stubborn acts, people went back to being who they were before terror asked them to change. That stubbornness is not naivete. It is an active reclamation of life. When I close my eyes and try to hold the image of that October in my mind, I see a city moving through foggy mornings, people with their hands in their pockets, and a long blue sedan that changed the way we folded the small rituals of daily life. I see the relief that came with the arrest at a Maryland rest stop and the heavier, more complicated relief that comes with the passage of years. I still feel the echo of those weeks. The way a single, terrible plan carved a strange new shape into our routines, and how slowly, with legal verdicts, with memorials, with cautious renewal, we learn to live alongside the memory. I still remember the weight of the Halloween bag in my hand, that thin paper that rustled every time I shifted my palm, full of sugar, neon wrappers, and the trembling promise that tonight, for a few hours, the alley and the sidewalks would belong to us kids. I can taste that night again now. The cold air that made my breath fog like a small ghost, the wet sheen on the asphalt from the rain earlier, the way every porch light looked like a lighthouse beacon cutting through the dark. We were small-town children moving in a pack, daring each other down shadowed driveways, daring each other to say, trick or treat, to houses with families we only half knew. It was supposed to be a game that belonged to the harmless slice of childhood that made you believe the world still had rules. Knock, the door opens, you get a treat, you laugh, you run on. In my head, that's what Halloween always was. And then there are the nights you can't forget because they rearranged how you understand people. His house was the one with the orange porch light. He had a kind face. I remember that because later, when the newspapers did the work of naming what happened, people kept talking about how ordinary he seemed. I remember thinking, as kids do, that adults were made of steady things. They smelled faintly of tobacco or lemon cleaner. They had rules and soft hands and voices that told you to look both ways. He seemed like that. Steady, friendly. He was the kind of man who could say your name and not make it strange. That night, he was handing out candy at the top of his driveway like everyone else, smiling and chatting. He offered me a long, skinny candy I'd never seen before. One of those powdered straws, bright and sweet. I accepted it and moved on. I don't know why, but later that night, when the news came like a jagged voice, my mind kept returning to those thin, colorful tubes and the way his smile had seemed too polished, like someone practicing comfort. When they announced it on the radio the next day, it sounded like a bad joke. "A child died on Halloween," the anchor said, and my stomach hollowed out. Names came after. Timothy O'Brien, 8 years old. The paper printed the picture, a round little face neatly combed into a bowl cut, an ordinary child's face that would become the thing people pressed against their palms in quiet, guilty prayer. It took a moment to understand the shape of what had happened. The police found the candy, the same bright straws. They tested them. They found cyanide. It was the kind of chemical name you only ever met in textbooks or movies, the kind of thing that makes your brain step aside and say, no, that can't be real. But it was real. It was in the wrappers. It was in a father's hand. My father had always taught me that families were a fortress. That lesson broke like glass when the world told us that Timothy hadn't been attacked by a stranger or some shadow through a window. The person who gave the child the poison candy was his own father. The town gathered like it always did when something terrible happened. In lines at the hardware store, at the counter at Mabel's Diner, on the front steps of the courthouse. Everyone wanted to talk away the empty feeling, like the chatter could glue the pieces of us back together. There was rage, of course. There was grief. There was an odd, relentless fascination. The way people lean toward an accident to count the danger in their own lives and try to measure how likely it is to come for them. Over the next few days, the story changed from rumor to a slow, meticulous unwrapping. I watched men in suits and badges talk in measured sentences on the porch steps. I heard the word motive used like a scalpel, cutting free the possibility that this had been a senseless accident. Papers printed details I couldn't unhear. There were new life insurance policies, they said. He had taken out them out on his children days before. That the smiling man at the driveway had been making transactions you couldn't reconcile with fatherhood. It made the mind work too hard, trying to put together how one person could wear both faces. There was a trial. You could have read about it in the paper, right next to the obituaries and the high school football scores. People lined up outside the courthouse to get a seat. The smell of the town, the rhythm of it, moved forward around the case like hands on a clock. He was, eventually, found guilty. They called him by his proper name in the headlines, the one that would always be followed by that awful new nickname, the Candyman. When he was sentenced, I remember feeling something that was not only satisfaction or vengeance. It was deeper, an abysmal tiredness. The conviction did not return what had been stolen. You can find justice and still be left with that small, raw absence where a child's laughter used to be. That emptiness is a kind you don't know how to fold away. You'll learn the shape of it by living around it. Years later, when I walked past that house again, long after the trial and the long, slow funerals and the salt of tears had dried into memory, it felt like seeing a stage set without actors. The porch lights still burned orange on Halloween. People still put out bags of candy. The ritual persisted, stubborn and necessary. But something in the edges had changed. Where I used to feel carefree about the risk of the world, I now felt a taut awareness, a smaller, careful self. I checked the sidewalks for cars. I saw the faces of neighbors differently, cataloging, briefly, the difference between ordinary kindness and practiced ease. I don't tell this story for shock alone. I tell it because the true horror of that October night wasn't the method or the poison or even the conspiracy of motive. It was that intimacy of betrayal. To have harm come from the shape that stares back at you in the mirror is a particular cruelty. We trust the people closest to us to be the keepers of our small safety. When that trust is violated, the inversion spits at the foundation of how we keep ourselves whole. There is another detail that kept coming back to me, one that you don't find in the court transcripts, but you hear in the way the town spoke. How ordinary the father had seemed. Sometimes the most monstrous things slip on a familiar face so smoothly that they pass through unnoticed. I think that's why this case reverberated. It suggested, and I use the word carefully because I do not want to speak for others, that malevolence doesn't always announce itself with horns. Sometimes it arrives with a practiced laugh and a paper bag of candy. The nights after the case were full of people swapping small rituals they believed would protect children, checking candy, discarding unwrapped sweets, paring down trick-or-treat routes to the most well-lit neighbors. We grew more suspicious, and for a while suspicion felt like armor. But it was a brittle armor. The town's trust was punctured, and it never quite reckoned the same way. At the funeral, I remember standing at a distance watching that small procession move with the heaviness of all things too brief. A child's casket is an apparatus of unbearable contradiction. Too small for the solemnity, too final for the heart. People handed tissues and patted backs and tried to hold the frame of a life into shape. Later that night, in the quiet, someone lit a candle on the porch of a neighbor's house. It was the simplest of gestures, a small light against the dark. I have often thought about the ripple effects of one person's choice. The poison candy did not just kill Timothy. It rewired the neighborhood's sense of safety, altered the rhythms of holidays, forced people into practices that made the possibility of violence an everyday calculation rather than an abstract news item. A single act, done in a particular moment, can reorient an entire town. People asked why. They asked the jury, the psychologists, the neighbors. Some people said greed. Some people searched for deeper psychological explanations, for a lesson in signs missed. Others refused to look too closely because the image of a father killing his own child is jagged and doesn't fit in the tidy boxes the mind likes to use. It is messy and corrosive and refuses to simplify into a moral. I don't have a tidy answer. What I have is the memory of a street that used to feel like a harbor and then didn't, and the small, steady grief of a community that went on living around the absence. Sometimes, years later, I think about the children who were that age then, the ones who had been on the sidewalks, who had taken candy, who had watched the news. How those years shaped them. Did it teach a certain caution? Did it teach them how easily trust could fracture? I can imagine sometimes a person walking through Halloween houses and thinking of that orange porch light and feeling a reflexive tightening in the chest. That tightening is a scar. Scars mark where we healed, or where we learned to carry the pain without naming it daily. I won't pretend there is anything useful to mine from the tragedy of that night. There is only a testimony that evil sometimes wears a familiar face, and that our rituals, even the small, seemingly sacred ones like collecting candy, rest upon fragile assumptions of safety. You can patch those assumptions with locks and checks and stern instructions, but the core thing we want for children is confidence in the world. When that is taken, you cannot simply replace it like a toy. If there is one thing I can give as a final line to this retelling, it is this. We remember Timothy not because he died in a way that made headlines, but because a child's life is itself an irreplaceable kind of light. The rest of us, the ones who walk those wet sidewalks, whose laughter turned into whispers, carry that light forward in different ways. We watch porches a little closer. We learn to ask questions we once thought rude. We keep candles on some October nights, and when we do, we let them burn not only for sadness, but for the stubborn insistence that, despite what happened, people can choose care and decency and the quieter kind of courage that looks after the smallest among us. And every Halloween since, when I accept a thin paper bag and feel the rustle of candy inside, I cannot help but look for the face that hands it to me, to check if it is the kindly, ordinary face I once trusted, or a fault line waiting to be discovered